everyone. This is Catherine Murray. I'm the Executive Director of Premier Adoption Agency, and I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you who are back to listen to Module 2. In this module, we are going to be diving into the Hague Convention in a little bit more depth. And so, everyone, hold on, and let's just dive in and get started. Okay, so what is the Hague Convention? The Hague Convention is known by a couple of different names. In adoption, we usually refer to it as the Hague or Hague Standards, but the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption is officially known as the Hague Convention on the Protection of Children and Cooperation in Respect of Intercountry Adoption. So it's basically an international treaty that was signed by several initiatory countries that's all sat down in 1993 and decided on uniform protocols as it related to the protection of children. So not only does intercountry adoption fall under this treaty, but also the abduction of children. So if there's a child that was kidnapped in one of the convention countries, there is a specific protocol that every convention country is required to follow when it comes to the protection of a child in any fashion. So it is designed to prevent child trafficking, abduction, any ethical practices. And for us in adoption, the Hague Convention essentially stands for the prohibition on the buying and selling of children. This is just a fun fact for you because I didn't know this when I first started learning about the Hague Standards and what the Hague Convention was all about. But this particular treaty, the Hague Convention, is named after a city in the Netherlands called The Hague. So anyway, I have on your slide a little dot for that where it is. It's a little seaside city where apparently a lot of these treaties are signed, and it sounds really, really beautiful. But that is why it is called The Hague. So, like I said, the Hague Convention is synonymous with the prohibition on child buying. Essentially, it is a lot of standards in which we have to have policies and procedures around which all are directed towards how we as an adoption agency prevent the buying and selling of a child. So for Premier Adoption, we have a specific policy that is our prohibition. So essentially it says Premier Adoption Agency prohibits our employees, agents, and affiliates from giving money or other consideration directly or indirectly to a child's parents or other individuals or an entity as payment for the child or as an incentive or inducement to release the child. Premier Adoption works ethically and diligently on the best interests of a child and does not engage in any form of child buying or child trafficking. Where necessary or appropriate, and if permitted or required by the child's country of origin, the agency shall send reasonable payments for activities related to the adoption, such as amounts to cover pre-birth expenses, including birth mother living expenses during the prenatal period and medical costs, child care, prenatal and postnatal care of the birth mother, or the provision of child welfare and child protective services. Permitted or required contributions shall not be remitted as payment for the child or as an inducement to release the child. Thank you for allowing me to read that. I know that it's really difficult for me when presenters read directly from the slide, but all of these standards and policies that we are going to be reviewing in this module all come back to the central theme that you cannot buy or sell a child. Okay, so some fun facts about the Hague Convention. It entered into full force in the United States April 1st, 2008. So what this means for licensed adoption agencies who operate within the United States is that to provide intercountry adoption services, they must now be accredited. So as of now, the last count, 101 countries are now party to the Hague Convention, which is a lot. And then each convention country must identify a central authority. In the United States, our central authority is the State Department. The Hague Convention applies to adoptions that proceed between two countries where the Hague Convention has entered into force. And so, again, they're just uniform standards that have been created so that any convention country can follow these standards and everyone will know how an adoption is to proceed between one country to another. So as you can see here, there's more information that's available. If you want to read the entire thing, you're more than welcome. You can get on this website and read the entire convention in your spare time. Okay, like I mentioned in the previous slide, the Hague Convention set up uniform standards for every convention country, and one of those requirements is to identify what is called a central authority. And in the United States, our central authority is the State Department. So Premier Adoption is Hague accredited by the State Department to provide incoming adoption services and outgoing adoption services. We only have outgoing programs, but let me quickly tell you the difference between the two. So incoming adoptions are described as those adoptions of a child who has been identified outside of the United States, who is going to be adopted by a prospective adoptive parent or parents who are citizens of the United States. So the child's country of origin, that would be declared the sending country, and then the United States would be the receiving country. Now, it's the reverse with an outgoing adoption. So the outgoing adoptions are the types of adoptions that Premier does. So a child is born, country of origin would be the United States, and then a prospective adoptive parent would be selected by the birth parent who resides outside of the United States. And therefore, the child would go from the United States out to the receiving country, which is outside of the United States. So we are sending a child out. Okay, some of the primary objectives of the convention are to, first of all, establish safeguards to ensure that intercountry adoptions take place in the best interests of the child. It also establishes a system of cooperation among all convention countries to make sure these safeguards are enforced. And the ultimate goal is, again, to prevent abduction, the sale of, and trafficking of children. It also secures mutual recognition of adoptions that are conducted between two convention countries. So there is no question about the legality of an adoption between two countries. Okay, so let's circle back to the two types of adoptions that are conducted under the Hague. The first one that I referred to with the example about Ethiopia is called incoming. These are adoptions where the adopted child's country of origin is not the United States. So the United States is considered the receiving country, and the child's country of origin is considered the sending country. So the reverse is true in outgoing adoptions. In an outgoing adoption, it is an adoption where the child's adopted country of origin is the United States. So the United States is considered the sending country, And let's give an example that a birth parent chose a prospective adoptive couple in British Columbia. So the receiving country in that case would be Canada. So first and foremost, in the convention standards, there is a lot of discussion and requirements that the agency must meet where ethical considerations are paramount. So all adoptions must be conducted in an ethical, transparent, and child-centered way with no financial inducements or coercion that's allowed. Consents or relinquishments must be informed and legally valid. The child must be free for adoption under our state laws. And a receiving country's adoption laws are a little bit more time intensive. They often will require years and years before an adoption is legally finalized in the receiving country. And so most often, even though the receiving country is, for example, British Columbia, let's say the child was born in Las Vegas. So the adoption will be finalized typically under the laws of Nevada, because in 6 months an adoption can be finalized, where in other countries they don't have that luxury. Typically, it's 1 to 2 years. The Hague Convention identifies 6 adoption services that must be conducted in order to complete an adoption. And they're very, very similar to what you're used to in terms of how adoptions are conducted here in the United States, but they break them down into specific services. So let's talk about that for just a moment. In the green, it is the process of identifying a child for adoption and arranging the adoption. The second service is the termination of parental rights, which consists of obtaining the consent or the termination of parental rights to an adoption. So in the United States, a birth parent will voluntarily relinquish or consent to the adoption. In a foreign country, typically these children that are available for adoption have been in institutionalized care or in foster care, and so it's up to the state or federal or whichever child welfare organization is the one governing that will determine that legal termination of parental rights have been conducted and completed. So here in the blue is a home study and background study. So a home study, if it's going to be an incoming adoption, the home study for the prospective adoptive parent must be completed and approved prior to the identification of a child. And it also mentions a child background study right here. And that is in the case of an outgoing adoption where the prospective adoptive parents are not citizens of the United States, and so their home study was conducted in their country of origin. For example, the province of British Columbia, an approved adoption agency would have performed the prospective adoptive parents' home study there and then sought the approval through their central authority, and then that is sent to an agency like Premier Adoption Agency, who conducts outgoing adoptions in the United States. We're approved to be able to do that. So because it's not a home study, it is a background study for outgoing, which means it's essentially a social study or a social summary that's conducted on the history of the birth parent and the child to be adopted. And I know you've likely completed a lot of those in domestic adoptions, but that's what that is. And then the one in purple, determining best interest. So one of the services that are required is to make a non-judicial determination of the child's best interests and the appropriateness of the adoptive home study. And that is on us as an adoption agency, but really it's the birth parent who is determining which adoptive family she feels would best serve the best interests of her child, and she or the birth family is able to read that home study if they would like to and ask any questions, just like they would in a domestic adoption. The one in the lilac is post placement. That is considered a Hague adoption service. So in the cases of countries in an incoming adoption, Ethiopia, let's say, the adoption would have been finalized in the country of Ethiopia, and so the child would be fully adopted coming into the United States. And so it would not be a post placement, it would be a post adoption report that is conducted, and that is not considered a Hague service because that child has been legally adopted by the parents already. In the case of an outgoing adoption, post placements are required. Let's say the child is the adoption is going to be finalized in Nevada. There would be 6 post placement visits required by the prospective adoptive parents in their own country that must be submitted in order for that adoption to be finalized in court in Nevada. There are 2 types of adoption service providers, which the acronym for that is ASP. So an adoption service provider is either a primary provider or can be considered either a supervised or exempt provider. So in all of Premier Adoption Agency's cases where we conduct outgoing adoption services, where the child is born in the United States and is being placed with a family who is a citizen of another country, we are always considered the primary provider. And so we are responsible for providing those 6 Hague services or finding a person who, an entity, an adoption agency, or an attorney who is licensed to be able to provide those adoption services in the state where they're licensed. And so let's say we have an adoption case. We're working with prospective adoptive parents from Canada who have been selected by a birth parent to adopt her child. And before the baby's born, she moves to California. Well, we now need to hire either an adoption attorney or a licensed adoption agency licensed under the laws of California to be able to provide these services. And we will sign an agreement with that provider, which is either a supervised provider agreement or an exempt. And the difference is if a provider provides one service only, then they can be considered exempt. But if it is one or more services, then the provider must be a supervised provider, which is a lot more in depth. Ongoing adoptions are really interesting and unique because they are more of a hybrid adoption, because we blend our domestic adoption laws with intercountry laws. Now, it is considered an intercountry adoption, but we will conduct all of the adoption services very much in accordance with a domestic adoption. And instead of an interstate compact or ICPC, we need to provide documents directly to the central authority in the receiving country. For example, if it's Canada, British Columbia, they have their own provincial central authority, and so all the documents would be sent there. But both sets of laws and regulations must be followed so that a child born in the United States can be legally adopted by parents residing outside of the country. As you know or may not know, every state in the United States has different laws, and it's the same for adoption laws. And so every state has a specific set of laws which govern the adoptions of children that happen in their own states. So we're going to go over a couple of slides which discuss specifics in the states in which we're licensed, which are Nevada, Arizona, and Utah, and we'll briefly discuss any adoption statutes under the state laws which pertain to intercountry. As I mentioned, we are licensed to operate in the states of Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. The state of Nevada was mum on the topic of intercountry adoption until just recently. We have a new set of revised adoption laws which are going into effect in a couple of weeks. And this is what it now says about intercountry adoption. It states, when Nevada families adopt children abroad, they often receive a foreign adoption decree. For legal reasons, it can be beneficial to or required to readopt the child in a U.S. court. And so adoptions in Nevada now will allow for readoption of a child so that that child receives a United States birth certificate and not a birth certificate that was originally done in, let's say, Ethiopia, because that's where the child was originally born. So it makes it easier for families who've adopted children abroad to be able to get them into kindergarten, schools, identification purposes. It's really great to have a US birth certificate where possible. So in Nevada, readoption was always legal to do, but it now has its own specific reference so that if judges have questions, they can refer to this statute, which is pretty great. As you can see, Arizona has a few little, in Utah, the adoption statutes only go as far as to define what an intercountry adoption is, but that's it. However, under the administrative code, which governs adoption agencies licensed under the laws of the state of Utah, there's an entire section that's dedicated to that. As promised, intercountry adoption definition in Utah. It means the adoption or placement for adoption of a child who resides in a foreign country at the time of the adoption or placement. Intercountry adoption includes an adoption finalized in the child's country of residence or in a state. So there you have it for Utah in their adoption statutes. As you can see, the state of Utah under their administrative code lists a lot more rules and regulations which need to be followed. And first and foremost, all intercountry adoptions are considered high needs, which is really, really great. And then under number 2, it specifies that the agency must be Hague accredited by the Department of State, approved by the accrediting body, and then goes on to list exactly what is required for adoption agencies to have in their files for relicensing under the laws of the state of Utah. For those of you providing intercountry adoption services in the state of Utah, I thought it was important that I provide a definition for what a high needs child is, which all intercountry adoptions are defined under the administrative code as having high needs. So that means it's a child with an attachment or trauma-related disorder, a child who suffered from prenatal exposure to drug or alcohol, who is a child who is the subject of an intercountry adoption, a child who was previously adopted, or who is in foster care. Okay, so let's go to the other side of this. We just talked about domestic laws as they relate to intercountry adoption. Let's talk a little bit about intercountry laws of the countries that we partner with in our outgoing program. So the United States is considered the sending country, and the receiving countries are Canada, the UK, and Ireland. They are Hague Convention countries and countries in which we have active agreements to be able to place children born in the United States with prospective adoptive parents who are approved to adopt in that receiving country. And so all receiving countries recognize the United States Adoption Authority. They coordinate with our central authority in order to complete an entire adoption. Compliance with both the United States and foreign regulations are required, and we must respect each other's country's legal process for the recognition and immigration of children. And for the most part, we work very fluidly with our adoption partners or the countries that are considered the receiving countries. Like I mentioned, our receiving country partners are Canada, United Kingdom, and Ireland. In Canada, we work specifically with the province of British Columbia, which has its own central authority, Saskatchewan, again, which has its own central authority, and Ontario, which has its own central authority. That works really well on the provincial level and makes it so that we can have a great dialogue if there are issues or questions that come up along the way. We know um, those central authority directors really, really well. And so it's always a pleasure working with Canada. In the United Kingdom, um, we work with an adoption agency there in London. England is the only country within the United Kingdom that we work in, but their central authority is in London, and great relationship there. Ireland, same. We work with an adoption agency and they work directly with their central authority. And so that tends to work out really well. None of the laws in these countries conflict with our laws. And the only hiccup would be Ireland, which requires their prospective adoptive parents to stay in the United States for 6 weeks. And which isn't a problem. Typically, adoptive parents stay in the country for at least 6 weeks, if not 12 weeks, after the child is placed in with them. So our Hague standards require that we specifically address cultural diversity of the population that we serve. And I think this requirement was intended for incoming adoptions where children are adopted from all over the globe. And so culture is very, very important to be preserved in those cases. I would like to take the opportunity to review all of this within the scope and through the lens of a domestic placement because the requirement is cultural diversity of the population that we serve, and the majority of placements that we do occur within Las Vegas, Reno, Phoenix, and Salt Lake City. And so those populations are a little diverse. But let's talk about how we can prepare adoptive parents for the adoption of a transracially adopted child. I want to break it down into the very foundation, which is family culture. So, the family culture is considered the traditions, habits, practices, and values that each family has. It defines who you are as a family and what makes you different from other families in the world. It's called your family identity. Okay, let's jump over into cultural identity and how that blends in with ethnicity in a transracial adoption. So, culture refers to beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, language, and traditions that are learned and shared by a group of people. So, examples of integrating culture at home for adoptive parents would be learning to speak Spanish, speaking Spanish at home, celebrating the Lunar New Year, eating traditional foods from that culture, such as injera if the child was adopted from Ethiopia, or tamales if adopted from Mexico or South America. Um, and approaches to parenting could include more spiritual aspects as well. So People of different ethnic backgrounds also share a common culture. So let's get a definition of ethnicity. Ethnicity is biological, it's inherited with a historical ancestry. And like I mentioned, ethnicity is, even though it's inherited, it's often expressed culturally. So examples um, would be for adopting an African American child. So the ethnicity of that child would be a descendant of enslaved Africans brought to the United States. And culturally, they are deeply rooted in the history of resilience, soul food, gospel, hip hop, civil rights heritage, Juneteenth, etc. So, in a transracial adoption, for many children, their sense of identity is often rooted not only in their biology, which is their ethnicity, but culturally, because that's the expression of their ethnicity. So, the topic of cultural diversity and cultural competency is one that's been on the rise for years now, and I see it particularly as our continuing education credit topics change, and the majority of states now require some form of cultural competency, cultural diversity for every renewal cycle of a social work license. And so it's fairly easy now for us to translate that information over into our adoption practice and educate prospective adoptive parents in particular on the importance of understanding what their own biases are through their own cultural lens if they are seeking to adopt a child of a different ethnicity. So, cultural competence kind of suggests a mastery of the culture, understanding just kind of the basics, where cultural humility is more of a lifelong process of curiosity and a desire to listen and learn, asking questions, and always acknowledging the limits of our own cultural lens. Let's talk a little bit more about cultural humility as it relates to parenting adopted children. Cultural humility is a lifelong practice of listening, learning, and being curious about our own cultural lens that we see through. It's about listening and learning over assuming. When prospective adoptive parents can understand that parenting techniques in this way should be approached with curiosity, ask questions, seek to understand before seeking to be understood, and even be willing to admit that they don't have all the answers. And it's also learning how to adopt a posture of humility and curiosity as you raise a child with a culture that's so much different from your own. This is going to require self-reflection, bias awareness, and even fostering critical consciousness. When I was researching for information on this topic, I really liked the get clued in as a transracial parent. I love that acronym CLUED. It stands for See, Consider the Lifelong and Multi-Generational Impact. So it's not just, hey, we're open to any ethnicity, hoping to get matched faster with a child. There really needs to be incredible consideration as to that the impact that it will have on this child if this child looks different from everyone else in the family. L, listen to your child. Again, it's that humility and curiosity that is going to make the difference in a child's life, knowing that their parents are really open to what they're experiencing. U is understand stereotypes. E, explore the internal and external cultural values of your child's racial background. And D, day-to-day intentionality, and even suggesting to prospective adoptive parents that they evaluate the neighborhood in which they live, see how much diversity is there, and do they need to incorporate into their lives, into their friendship circles, more friends that have more ethnic diversity than what they currently have. Places of worship. What do the other parishioners appear like? How much diversity are in their churches, community centers, schools, making sure that their child is going to feel like they belong because other people that they see in their world are going to be people who look like them. I grabbed a couple of quotes from a podcast that I was listening to. It's entitled Growing Up Transracially Adopted: Stories of Race, Culture, and Identity. Um, One of the podcasts that jumped out at me was one that was done um, by an adoptee by the name of Rebecca Hudson, and she says this: there is not really any standard curriculum or support or anything for transracial adoption. Like when I asked my mom if they even gave her any resources or anything, and she said all they gave her was this piece of paper that said basically, will you love your child regardless of color, gender, anything like that? And you just had to say yes. And then it was like, okay, here's this Black child for you and have fun. And that's just not enough resources. There's so much value in that. I've been doing this for 27 years now, and fortunately, things have really changed, and the emphasis on deep diving resources for families and encouraging them to find classes and attend trainings on the diversity if they are planning to adopt a transracially adopted child. It's the information's so accessible now, and it's just a matter of making sure that our families do understand how critical this is for the success of this placement, and not that it will disrupt in any way, but the success of their child and how plugged in this child feels as they go through those developmental milestones, and the importance of being aware of your own cultural bias as a parent is really, really vital. Okay, I couldn't help myself. Here's another quote from that same podcast. This is from Shruti Shah, who's also an adoptee. So he says, make sure that you find your child a good therapist from an early age, but also I think finding a community of people that look like them, with adults that they can look up to and learn from, is really, really important. I think a lot of adopted kids that grow up in families where people don't look like them don't have reference points for what success looks like for people that look like me. Okay, probably everyone has heard about an adoption life book, but I thought that I would include this as a resource that you can give to prospective adoptive parents, whether or not they are planning to adopt a transracial child. But an adoption life book is wonderful no matter what. So, what it is, if you don't know, it's a personalized, age appropriate storybook that tells the child's story from birth to coming to their family for adoption. Most of the time, it includes photos or documents, both handwritten notes, and explains the story about how the child came to be adopted. It helps the child with identity formation questions such as, who am I? In a very truth-based way. In transracial adoptions, it can include racial identity affirming content and offer bridges to their racial and ethnic roots. From a young age, it puts the child in control of their story and helps them develop a self-affirming life narrative, which is very critical to mental health. And it serves to validate their lived experience, which we know promotes resilience and belonging. Yay! You have successfully completed Module 2 of our Orientation to Intercountry Adoption. I greatly appreciate all of you sticking with me and learning about all of these different aspects to intercountry adoption. The last module will focus specifically on ethics, which will talk more about the prohibition on child buying, and will outline specific policies that our agency has developed that are in alignment with our Hague standards and how we operate as an intercountry adoption agency. So stick around and be sure to click on the last module, and after that you will receive a certificate of completion. Thanks again, everyone.